Hello everyone. So in the lead up to Lá Bealtaine or May Day or Beltane, I wanted to start talking a little bit about fairies and fairy faith. Mostly I want to do this from a personal gnosis creative perspective, but as with most things that I explore, I do tend to prefer to pipe in a lot of very specific references, stylistic influences, and so on into my creative endeavors, into my magical workings, into my own personal blend of fairy faith and so on. And it occurred to me that before I start doing and going through that exploration here on YouTube or over on the blog, it would be useful to have this video, which will be more about folklore and fairy faith or fairy resources from the research perspective. Which is not to say, because this is not the intention, it's not to say that this video is going to be gatekeepy in any capacity. This is not to make any claims whatsoever about you know, one way of doing things being more legitimate than another. But I really enjoy the nuance and the cognitive dissonance between what is understood to be collectively in consensus reality the case, say something pertaining to a particular traditional belief or something, geographical relevance and so on. Things that can be vetted and researched and established, not just in academic terms, but also on the ground, in a practitioner-based perspective, but from a more sort of actually verified perspective, things like that, and then the realm of creativity and inspiration. There's a lot of dissonance between these two things because, of course, if we are doing our own magical workings and we're doing our utmost and our best to fashion something for ourselves that is personally potent, creatively potent, and so on, there's going to be an element of eclecticism and syncretism in that. And for me, the cognitive dissonance that comes out of these two worlds, amalgamating the two, is a really, really interesting, highly alchemical process. And I personally derive a lot of satisfaction from knowing what those details are, what the main influences are, and keeping track of those things myself. It means that when I look at my own work, I understand what I'm looking at better. It also means that when I look at the work of others, I can still function from a perspective of personal inspiration, but also see the differences in where my inspiration or my understanding of something might differ from that which was put into a piece. The more we're able to kind of articulate and maintain these distinctions, I think the better our skill as magical practitioners, creatives, tarot readers, and so on will be. A few reasons other than that I want to make this video. One is that I live in Ireland, but I am not of Irish national origin. I am still an American from the USA by nationality. Perhaps that will change at some point. Ideally, it would, just personally. The reason this is relevant is because in recent times, the socio-political, geopolitical climate in Ireland has been, as it is periodically, rather tense. There's a lot of stuff going on in Europe that is currently really, really tense around the status of people who are immigrants and so on. In particular in Ireland, the tourist industry is one of the contributing factors in the intensity of things like homelessness and joblessness and the sort of depletion of the landscape or the depletion of the local nature and or the recognizable aspects of certain cities and so on. This is a governmental thing. It's you know, there's a lot of nuance about these sorts of experiences, and it's leading to a lot of tension, much of which is focused or is coming from a perspective of misunderstanding, willful or otherwise. But the tourist industry presents a version of Ireland that does not necessarily match what the actual place is like. And I am well aware, for example, that this can cause a lot of problems for people who are Irish, who exist in an online space and are trying to talk about their experiences here, folklorically, culturally, if they practice witchcraft from their own witchcraft perspective and so on. And there's a lot of very, very strong feelings that get passed around and a lot of strong declarations that get passed around, much of which can become very gatekeepy. And at least from my anecdotal observation, a lot of that gatekeeping nature actually comes from those who do not reside or are not from the nation of Ireland itself. I think there's a really, really strong emphasis on things like heritage, which of course can be very potent and important for people, but it gets very muddy very quickly, and I think my status as an immigrant from a country that is particularly guilty of some of these things makes talking about these things very awkward. So I wanted to discuss some resources for how people might absolutely follow their own personal inspiration and creativity, their own magical workings or understandings, but in a way that facilitates them finding, like, what do they want to be more informed about and why? How does that make them feel excited about the next thing? That kind of thing. Like facilitating better information, but from the perspective of this is a chance for agency, is kind of what this video is for. Hopefully I said that the way I wanted to say that. But also, the third kind of main reason is that I'm a former archivist and rare books librarian. And I've worked in a lot of different institutions, both in the US but also overseas. I've worked in England and I've also worked in Ireland. And I really care about making it clear that lots of different types of resources are available to the general public, but also making it, like, demystifying a little bit some of that I think would be important, especially as, you know, many people in the sort of pagan circles, witchcraft circles, spiritual circles will be familiar with the frustration that a lot of us encounter, like a where are the advanced books kind of frustration. And I think, you know, demystifying some of the ways in which one pursues advanced material would actually help clarify why we don't see that on bookshelves in bookstores, for example. So those are some of the baseline reasons I want to make this video. I'm going to try and keep it fairly basic though. I'm just going to be introducing some of these things as baseline concepts, with some possible decks and books just being kind of shown along the way. So do forgive me if I end up just saying something that, like, many of you are already well aware of. I'm not presuming that whoever's watching this doesn't know any of these things, or has never encountered them before, or indeed never done many of them before. I'm actually presuming that it's likely that I will end up duplicating, like, what people already know. But as I said, it seemed useful to me to have something like this on the channel before I launch into my own creative explorations of some of these themes in a more public fashion. Okay, so the first thing that I want to kind of cover is, what are we looking at when we're talking about resources? Three primary categories: primary, secondary, and tertiary resources are what matter here in this part of the discussion. A primary resource is something that is from, say, if it's a historical time period, from the time period in question. A primary resource is something that's written from the perspective of the topic of study. So if we are curious about something to do with fairy faith, it would matter that we specify what our primary resource material is going to be. If what you want to do is look into something around more traditional aspects of fairy faith in a given region, it wouldn't do to go, like, let's say you were interested in something to do with Ireland and it's a certain type of thing to do with fairy faith. Maybe it has to do with something like ring forts and their development over time or something like that, right? You might want to be clear about what you're looking at. Your primary resources to do with the initial construction of a ring fort may or may not have much to do with fairy faith whatsoever, because that may or may not be a medieval phenomenon and an architectural one. You might end up wanting to look at something, say, from the 19th century, from a certain region in Ireland, and correspondingly, therefore, maybe somebody writing about ring forts from the 1970s in England would actually not be so helpful in facilitating your goal, if your goal is something a little bit more intensely traditional from a primary resources perspective. So one of those things might be writing about 19th century perspectives. One of the things is 19th century perspectives itself, if we have extant texts or whatever. Another is writing about the 19th century, maybe hopefully from a well-cited, well-vetted informational perspective, leaving personal gnosis out of it. That would be the secondary resource. A tertiary resource is what this video is. Because it does not count as a secondary resource, because what I'm not doing is talking about the exact topic in particular, like doing proper thorough research and then citing literally all of my sources, double checking all of my arguments, and also having something like a copy editor look over it, another academic in a given field or another professional in the field, and so on and so forth. I'm sitting down in front of a camera giving something vaguely in the style of a lecture, which also does not count as a secondary resource. Lectures often follow the production of a secondary resource if it's something like from within academia. The reason this matters is if you are looking up something in a bookshop, it might be useful to understand what you're looking at. It might be useful, therefore, when you flip to the sources cited section. Like, let's say you pick up a book and it says on the cover that it wants to teach you about witchcraft or fairies or something like that, something folkloric. It uses all the buzzwords, and you go to the sources cited section. You're going to want to start to understand how many of those sources are what type of sources, and furthermore from there, where those sources have been obtained from. Are they from museums? Are they from archives? Are they from the private collection of so-and-so and so-and-so? Are they from a database? You may also then start to get a feel over time for your own preferences. So let's say perfect accuracy in your research is not actually your main priority. So you may then choose to deprioritize the presence of primary resource material and well-vetted secondary resource material in your sources cited section. But knowing the difference between these things over time will help you articulate that. If what you want is something that is more rooted in, say, 1990s eclecticism, knowing the difference between those sorts of resources is going to actually help you figure out which books you're looking at and what perspective they're coming from. And that in turn can help you get closer to what you prefer personally. And then if someone ever did ask you, oh, what sorts of things are you into? You'd be able to just say, oh, it's actually this kind of thing, and here's how I went about doing that. Okay, so another thing to consider, in general terms, is, well, a few things. I'm looking at my notes here, obviously. Topic, discipline, methods, so things like well-vetted material, peer-reviewed material, thorough citation, that kind of thing. So topic, discipline, method, and perspective. It will make a difference if you're looking at a resource, an article, a book, a video, a lecture, a podcast, and so on. It will make a difference what the topic of that is. Folklore or fairy faith, or even fairy faith in Celtic regions, or fairy faith in Ireland, or whatever it is in the title, is not necessarily the same as the topic. Many things can have very, very similar, especially in these days of algorithmic buzzwords and so on, hashtags. They can have very similar looking titles, how to blah, blah, blah with fairies, but they may actually be approaching that from completely different topical lenses. This is not only going to apply in terms of like someone may wish to articulate the difference between, say, Irish fairy faith and Welsh fairy faith. There may even be differences in the regions of the country you're talking about. There certainly will be linguistically in Ireland with the way Irish even works from region to region, right? But even if you're not going that granular with it, if you have someone who's coming from, like, using a sort of a modern spiritual perspective, if you're listening to someone who's coming at it from a more eclectic perspective, their topic of discussion may be more likely to reflect 60s and 70s stylistic preferences around fairies, and they may be exploring many of those things more through the lens of things like children's books or fairy tales or well-illustrated works of art, books, art books and so on. Depending on how they want to talk about fairies and folklore and so on, they may be much more likely to focus on things like 1980s fantasy films and the way they represent fairies, and they may sprinkle in things that also align with more traditional perspectives, but it would be useful to know topically that there's a difference. Similarly, if you are coming across someone who's coming at something from a very sort of, say, British traditional perspective, you're going to have a very different understanding of fairies there than you would from an Irish folkloric perspective in a lot of cases. And knowing how and when you want to blend those things, knowing what you're getting when you go into, say, a tertiary resource or something, or even a secondary resource, like knowing what they're actually specifying their topic is going to be really important. It's going to help you then understand where you want the information you want to consume to slot in to your current, like, accumulation of information. And it will indeed kind of help you remember the things that you learn, because the entire point is it'll start to fit into a whole, like, local network of things in your own head. Therefore, as I kind of have indicated, the discipline that someone is writing from is going to be very, very important. It makes a huge difference whether someone is writing from an academic sociological perspective about fairies versus whether someone's writing from an academic historical perspective about fairies. And then furthermore, if someone is a practitioner, that's going to be a world of difference all over again. There are even circumstances in which someone writing from the historical or the current sociological perspective, from an academic perspective, on topics like fairy faith or May Day or whatever, end up inadvertently influencing their given demographic of study. Because if what they're doing, for example, is researching contemporary paganism or contemporary versions, current versions of fairy faith, and they publish an article, and then their demographic that is their source material, their sample demographic, if you will, reads their article and thinks that that's some source of wisdom about what the truth behind the matter is, you end up having a feedback loop, or the potential for one, in terms of what the academic is trying to study and then inadvertently influencing the thing they're studying. I have actually come across academics who have mentioned this, that it's a real danger. So perhaps that's inevitable. It seems likely to me that that's inevitable, especially in this day and age of lots of informational access and so on. However, being aware of the discipline of the material you're looking at will at the very least prep people better for contextualizing what they're reading. You can still take inspiration from things, but knowing that that's what you've done, rather than thinking you've read something that reflects historical research when it's current and sociological, for example, knowing that difference in tone and indeed the difference in methodology for how that research is compiled is really, really important. And maybe some of this is a little bit lofty and seemingly obscure, but also being able to say to yourself, well, that's a bit lofty and obscure for me. I don't feel like doing it quite that way, but here's why, is going to be really important. So that leads into the idea of methods. Folklorically, what you often get, for example, is field notes. A lot of how historical academic information is compiled is going to be like years of trawling through incredibly obscure, very, very dense records. Things like property records, just for like variations on a place name. These are different methodologies, and they're going to contribute to different types of conclusions. Lots of academics will actually blend different methodologies, but they have to specify in their work what they're doing. If you're not coming at it from an academic perspective, let's say you want to look into the methodology of a given magical practitioner, understanding who has read their work, who has vetted their work, what the consensus view on that is, comparing and contrasting your own understanding, but furthermore, understanding how that practitioner has compiled their stuff over time, beyond just the blanket, like, been a practitioner for 20 years joke, you know the common reference, right? Okay, what kind of practitioner? What people have they worked with? How frequently? Is that information available? Who are their professional contacts? Do those professional contacts themselves have things like qualifications? Are they acknowledged in the country that's relevant? In the case of Ireland, there are absolutely practitioners here who are registered religious community leaders within their own tradition and demographic, and you can look these things up. These things are available. Correspondingly, that means that when you cannot find that kind of information about someone you're looking for guidance from, that's important. You may well choose that you don't really care if it's not important because you find what they're saying really inspiring. It seems like really, really good common sense, and it's just lighting your brain on fire and you're getting lots of ideas. It makes you want to go to your sketchbook. It makes you want to journal. It makes you want to do magic. That's incredibly valid and important, but it's equally valid and important to know that you could not find that information. So you get to decide if that doesn't matter to you, but it's useful to then be able to remember that that information was not available. And then the last bit in that section is the idea of perspective. So one really key example of this would be nation of origin, nationality. It's going to really matter. If you look up something about fairies, it's going to be a very different ballgame if you're looking up something much more influenced by an English understanding of fairies. Indeed, it'll be important to know when the concept of England first emerged for the type of fairy faith or historical information or modern information you're looking at. If you're looking at something really medieval inspired, the modern iteration of the landmass that is currently called England is going to have like no relevance because it didn't exist yet. Not in that way, geopolitically. If you're looking at things to do with Ireland, and let's say you're on a trip in Ireland from abroad, and you love fairies and you want to talk to people about fairies, it would be useful, depending on who you're talking to and how open they are or not to this sort of thing, to know the difference between an English version of things versus an Irish version of things. That doesn't mean you have to do one thing or another, but otherwise you are going to end up potentially with signals crossed. The same words don't mean the same thing in every kind of situation. So once again, all of these sorts of forms of nuance and so on are up to you, but you get to then ask yourself these questions. And even just having the awareness that these sorts of questions exist, in my opinion, is a highly empowering thing. It can only lead to avenues for pursuing the information you end up choosing to pursue. So from there, I want to talk about resources, but also the ways we might specify the questions we have, what we're actually looking for out of our seekership. We are well familiar with the fact that academia has a lot of barriers to access. It does even for the academics themselves. For one thing, I think a lot of academics basically can't even afford to purchase their own books a lot of the time, or their own articles, because it appears in absurdly expensive journals. Or, you know, a lot of lectures and a lot of situations require you to be a college student to begin with. A lot of things can be highly proprietary. Copyright law really matters for reasons, but it's also sometimes a really, really big stumbling block for a lot of people. These things are have the capacity to be very highly double-edged. They have their uses and they have their incredible disadvantages as well. So what are some other ways that we can access things that don't rely on us being already able to, like, in the utmost to navigate those sorts of barriers to access? What are some more legitimate ways that we can access useful, vetted information, depending on the sort of topic we have in mind, and so on? First of all, from the academic perspective, seeking out articles and books is doable from a free perspective, you can join local class, or not from a free perspective, but from a less highly expensive perspective, depending on your circumstances. Articles and books can be on certain websites. If you have library memberships in certain places, you can have access to different databases that can get you access to articles. There may well be local classes available, either if you're in a university town or if you're near different types of museums or exhibitions. You know, books in particular obviously appeal to a lot of us, but books can be about all sorts of different things, and knowing what you're looking for when you go in may actually facilitate you finding things like secondhand books in various places. I have here one example. I got this. It's a vintage copy of The Fairies in Tradition and Literature by Catherine Briggs, a hugely well-known English, I believe, yeah, Oxford educated, folklorist from the 1970s mostly, I think. Yeah. Really, really big deal, right? Catherine Briggs, anyone who's into this sort of thing will know this name, English-based. I got this dirt cheap on Charing Cross Road, but it was also because I knew what to look for. If I'm scanning the shelves, I know what things I want, right? Now, somebody else may see this and pass it by because they don't really want it, and that's fine. Somebody else may see this and pass it by because they don't necessarily have a sense of what they're looking at. Or maybe they do and they pick it off the shelf and they go, yeah, but I don't actually know. How would I know? You know, having a sense of articles, even just by title, that are published by various people, or for the resources that you do have access to, seeing who they cite, even if you definitely can't afford the articles, can't get into the databases, can't buy any of the books, having a sense of some of the names that crop up that are the most cited, what the perspectives on those names are, will facilitate that when you come across something by chance where it might be free, or you know, this sort of thing happens sometimes in like book dump sites where you, like, you know, sidewalk library kind of things. That's the moment where you'll not actually be necessarily looking for something, but you'll be, you know, walking around old bookshops or something like that and go, oh, they have what? It's for how many pence? Like, what the? Okay, I'm buying it right now. You know, like that I can afford, you know, that sort of thing. So that's like books and articles and so on, a little bit more traditional media. Another thing to consider are archives, especially on the local level. A lot of the time, I think people get very intimidated by archives. Usually because certain types of archives do require personal identity and to be able to sign in, often to book your appointment in advance. Not all archives require this. The ones that do, it's usually for informational security reasons, because theft from archives can be a really huge problem. That's like the main purpose of these things. It's also helpful for them to then be able to file reports with their, you know, the sort of bottom line level reports, be able to track statistics and see how frequently their archives are being used, report that to the people who care, and then make a case for themselves being funded. That's what a lot of that sort of thing is for. It also helps safeguard personal information for archives that include sensitive data. None of that is really intended to keep the user at bay. So trust me, having been not only on the operational side of archives, but also on the receiving side as a neurodivergent individual, it can be very intimidating. But knowing why those measures are in place, where they're in place, may be a help to understanding that it's not about you, and everybody finds it awkward. When it's awkward, if you get to an archive and things feel awkward, it's because it's always awkward. It's fine. Nobody cares. Everyone's just trying to like get through their day, chart your name, and get on with things. However, a lot of local archives not only won't necessarily have those measures in place, or not to the same degree, but they will also have things like public education days where you can go for tours or come have a chat or go for a talk. They may do local exhibitions and events for children, free day out for the family. They may be looking for volunteers so that you can have lots of access to the archive, but then also help them facilitate providing access to others. And then furthermore, and that would also get you really, really familiar with what some of the other resources in your area are. Having conversations with people who run things on the local level will also start, depending on your research interest, start to give you a really good sense of some of the, like, let's say again, on the topic of fairies and folklore and so on. Let's say you live in a part of the United States, so you're not in Ireland, you're not in England, you're not in Scotland, or wherever else are these like desirable locations and so on. You can go to a local local history society, local archive. There are subject-specific archives as well. You may be able to find that you have access somewhere to a place that specializes in local storytelling and folkloric things in your area. And you may, like, let's say you're coming at it from a given state that has a known area that's dominated by a certain demographic and so on. And you may end up being able to find iterations of, say, Irish folklore that amalgamated into the more local understandings of the ecology in your state that blended to create the local folklore of your area. So if we talk from a magical practitioner perspective about things like genius loci, that would be one of the ways in which you could start to access what are some of the things around me. So for me, if I'm back in the States, I'm not, but if I was, and I obviously love Irish folklore, that would be one of the ways in which I start to seek out, okay, well, what are some of the ways in which this manifested over time in the area where I live? How can I start to participate with that? Are there collections about this in my area? Do I have access to that kind of thing? If I don't, or if there's nothing in my area, libraries, local museums, interlibrary loan, these are all amazing resources. Go talk to subject-specific reference librarians if your library has them. But if they don't, this is where having a sense of article titles, authors' names, things that you might not have access to or the funds to purchase, but having a catalog either in your head or a running list of some of the resources you want to look up, knowing all of the other nuances about the sorts of databases they might be likely to show up in, again, depending on nationality, depending on topic, and so on. Getting a feel for that sort of thing, whether it's from the practitioner-based perspective or whether it's from other sorts of perspectives, sociological, academic, historical, local, and then going to your library, if they don't have a subject-specific librarian, and saying, here's what I'm looking for, I think it's likely to be in these sorts of situations or sources, etc., etc. Can you help me, from an interlibrary loan perspective, access this material? You know? And again, the librarian may or may not at all be aware of the sort of thing you're talking about, but you then coming to the table with a bit more information should facilitate a really interesting conversation and get some juices flowing about local resources or access to further resources further afield. Another thing to bear in mind about libraries, archival collections, museums, and so on is that you actually, depending on where you are, also may have access to specialist collections, specialist libraries, specialist museums. One key example would be an art museum. Does the art museum also have a corresponding library attached to it? That may or may not be for internal use only, but it could never hurt to ask. Specialized libraries can also be that they're, you know, so-and-so former wealthy person from the 19th century donated their collection to such and such a local institution, so now they have one of the world's reigning collections about that topic in a really odd place in the middle of nowhere that just so happens to be near you. Being able to look these things up and wonder about them, get a sense of what places are around you, is only going to serve you in terms of getting a sense of where you're at and what your interests are, what you have access to. It makes it less daunting to just kind of constantly probe rather than go, oh my goodness, there's so many things to tackle. How would I know my left from my right in that process? There are people who literally their entire job, other than backlog cataloging, there are people whose entire job is to facilitate you and your questions. So one example from the fairy and folklore perspective about specialist collections would be a folkloric collection. A lot of these happen on local levels in lots of different places. Knowing what kind of question you want to ask and what sort of thing you're interested in is going to be pretty important to articulate, not because there's lots of pressure. You can and awe. I do all the time. I'm always like, you know, and I have worked in the field. But folkloric collections, for example, the understanding of the word folklore encompasses more than just fairies and fairy faith. And this may be of relevance, partly because just coming at a folklore collection and expecting them to only cater to fairy faith and understand what you're asking for without you specifying it is going to lead to some confusion, because they don't necessarily have everyone asking about what most people seem to think folklore is. So knowing how to ask them, not because there's an established protocol, but just because you're the one who has the question and they can't read your mind, is important. But also because there are many different types of folklore. So cities have folklore. What shops existed on what streets at different times will lend themselves to a highly local nature in an area. What demographics moved in. If we're talking about New York, things like which districts became predominantly Italian versus predominantly Irish. Who did they displace? What was there before? How did that amalgamate with what came afterwards? Were there tensions that came out of that? Do we see that reflected in something like storytelling of the time period? Does that overlap then with our understanding of genius loci? How might we amalgamate that into our ecological understanding of our surroundings on a personal inspiration level? We wouldn't be able to even ask ourselves that question if we didn't include cities or urban landscapes or suburban landscapes as having just as much folklore as our sort of stereotypical, traditional, wee fairy folk kind of perspective, as many's stereotypical one is. Like, a lot of places actually do have an awareness of this, but if we're talking mostly about like how a lot of people hear folklore, they think fairies, they think, you know, or they might think something else. But the point is to be able to nuance that and then localize things, or not, is going to be important, because that's what's going to help you steer better towards the sorts of questions you want to ask. And then from there, where you want to go with that creatively, magically, and so on. So again, bear in mind that I'm coming at this particular video knowing that what I want to do is something local to me, or at least Irish related. It's going to be fairy related and so on. So I am couching everything in these terms, also because that's one connection I'm making with Lá Bealtaine for reasons I'll go into another time. But the point is that your starting point may be something totally else, and that the techniques being discussed are, like, this is illustrative of how one person might do that, but that the techniques that are being discussed are some ways in which you might approach that. Some ways in which you might ask yourself questions. Let's see. In Ireland, for example, in cities, there are a lot of situations where even specific individuals formulate part of the folklore of an area, almost to the point of legendary status. Some really obvious examples, say for Dublin, would be like Johnny Fortycoats and Bang Bang, you know? The characters of an area can form part of the folklore. In Cork, there are certain shops that have been around on a certain street in particular that formulate a good portion of the folklore of that area of the city. And folkloric collections will have audio recordings of things. They will have record databases of different stories told. They'll have information about regional differences. You can go to folkloric collections and ask specifically to look at their field notes of certain researchers, specifically on the topic of fairy sightings from a certain geographical region. That's another thing where methodology will come into play, because if you're looking at field notes from a 19th century folkloric researcher, it's going to be important to know that there's a tendency in different eras to ask questions differently. We all are familiar with the idea of leading questions. So when someone ventures into a community to record what their beliefs are, they're the ones asking the questions, and then depending on the impact that has on the local community and the manner in which that is framed, even the manner in which the interview is conducted, is going to influence how we perceive the folklore of that region. So there's a lot of stuff around that, for example, with the understanding of Ireland and fairy faith that gets very, very muddy very quickly. Here is an example of a book, not by an Irish writer. Ireland's Immortals by Mark Williams is a little bit less fairy focused, more deity focused. but will give you a really, really good understanding of developments over time in Ireland, including up into modern arts and culture, and particular points of note about nationalist movements, for example, that came along and influenced methods of inquiry into the folklore of the rustic of the time period. Names we'll be familiar with: members of the Celtic Twilight, members of the Golden Dawn, Yeats being a key name, but there are others, A.E. Russell, etc. Many of these people, Lady Gregory, many of these people are well respected in ways and less so in others. You may very well feel that Yeats's poetry is really, really worthwhile, but a lot of his activities were so intensely nationalistic, and his understanding of Irish Catholic folklore in rural areas is going to come from a very sort of Anglo-Irish perspective on the one hand, but someone who's also actively in the middle of constructing what he wants to consider a modern nation of Ireland that at the time was a very fraught issue. And this absolutely gets worked into his understanding of UPG and so on. And it's very, very interesting, and it's really worth a look. And it's a good overview for lots of different topics, including the Middle Ages, including some Neolithic stuff. Yeah. Things like that really matter, but that's also from a much more sort of historical writing perspective. You could supplement that then with looking into actual recorded stories. There are current storytellers that exist, you know, kind of functioning within the Shanachie kind of style. You might also include musical stuff in your explorations. I've written a little bit on my blog about some of the ways that I like to make sure I know what versions of songs I'm listening to come from where and so on. So there are various indices online that chart this that are freely available. But another really good folkloric resource that will give you access to some fairy information if that's your interest are folk and traditional music-based archives, collections, performing groups, and so on. Traveling storytellers still being a thing, yeah. You know, people who go around collecting stories is still absolutely a thing. Podcasts can also help you at least get acquainted with this, a little bit like how Wikipedia will give you a good few things to Google and or you know, search in a more detailed manner, but is not a reliable source in and of itself. A lot of these tertiary resources are much more like entry points. So again, like I've discussed things like journal articles and so on, these sorts of things are more expensive, but depending on which ones you want to get and what names you're interested in, you may be able to occasionally obtain things that are more up your alley. And so, you know, thereby like pinpointing, okay, I can't afford to buy the entire run of such and such a journal, but I want that one issue, for example. I'm trying to think, do I have anything else to cover for this particular video? Oh yes, so furthermore, another thing to ask yourself about things like fairy faith is conceptually, what are we covering? What do we think we're talking about? What do we feel we're talking about? One such obvious thing would be like the landscape or the ecological component. In Ireland, many of these sorts of things are not really separable from an understanding of fairies or the good crowd, the other crowd. The fairy mounds being a sort of a quintessential example. Again, your perception of them is going to differ depending on what time period you're kind of operating out of, and who your source material is. Another thing that I think people possibly overlook with fairies is the potential connection with concepts of death. Death, traditionally practiced in Ireland or interfaced with in Ireland, is a very, very interesting topic. One that I'm actually woefully under-informed about and want to get more informed about. But death and the wake, tobacco in Ireland, like all these things have very interesting overlaps. There are some understandings potentially that, you know, the fairies are the souls of recently departed dead or things like that. There's concepts around Teachtain, which is one possible sort of holding place or stopping place for the dead on their way to whatever may or may not be considered an afterlife. Being able to even pin these things down using modern terminology can be really tricky. If you're asking yourself a question about whether fairies are the souls of the dead, like, do you mean medieval soul? Do you mean medieval afterlife? Do you mean 19th century concepts of afterlife? Are you using a modern sense of what death is to ask that question? And furthermore, that's going to help you understand the practices and influences on a certain area. So the impression I gather anecdotally is that people sometimes, especially from abroad, find it very frustrating that to interface with, say, Irish fairy faith is going to involve a lot of very Catholic and or Christian things, prayers, elements, and so on. But these things from a modern perspective are not so separable. The manner in which Catholicism has manifested over time, and not just post-1922 in Ireland, really is part of fairy faith in many ways. Certainly is part of the localized social, I'm thinking of the word hierarchy, but I'm not sure that's actually the word I want to use. Like social organization of how towns and things work and so on, how times of year work. So the amalgamation, you know, again, like a really obvious examples being things like Imbolc versus St. Bridget's Day. And again, even that is a really weird way to amalgamate concepts of like Catholic understandings of St. Bridget's Day and St. Bridget versus the tendency to use the term Imbolc now. Asking all these sorts of questions, then tying random days on the calendar, Lá Bealtaine being included, with fairy faith is going to be very interesting, and it matters not only whether or not you decide you want to include historical information or not, but what time period you're kind of doing with that. And again, everybody gets to sort of cut their teeth where they want, decide where they want to go with it, how far, how detailed, and so on. But kind of just knowing where you stopped and why is a useful thing. You get to decide these things, but then being able to tell yourself, here's why I decided that, is going to help cement the information that you want in your head, and it's going to help you better contextualize how and what you're doing, how you're doing what you're doing when you're talking to other people, because you may or may not be talking about the same thing. And being able to facilitate those conversations, I think, leads to a much more fertile ground for things like spiritual pursuit, creative pursuits, magical endeavors, if we're coming at it from that practitioner-based perspective. But the same applies for academic conversations. Or indeed conversations that are not academic but that are on the tertiary level, for example. Yeah, and so the last thing I'll just say is that while there are definitely resources that are not considered as viable, there are ways that if you find the more viable stuff, the more vetted, the more peer-reviewed and so on, if you find that kind of stuff really dense and difficult to get through, there are ways to help you detangle that and figure out what you want out of that, and also to recognize what you're looking at when you're looking at it. So I'll just grab an example real quick. So this book here is published by Cork University Press, by an academic who works at Cork in the folklore department, Garage O'Crulich. And it's the Book of the Kaya, Stories of the Wise Woman Healer. It is very dense. He is one of the known reigning experts on this topic. I have never managed to read it all the way through. I'm not even sure I've gotten very far into the first chapter ever. It's on the denser side for me, and in an academic writing style, I don't always struggle with academic writing styles, but sometimes I do. And this one, the last time I tried, I was even further in my burnout at the time. I'm a bit more recovered now. So I may try it again soon, but as of the last time I tried reading this book, I could not understand what I was looking at. And I understood kind of what bits of it were getting at, but I needed help. So a little bit in the style of Cliff Notes, I did have this, which is something that I normally, okay, here's me and my own shadow. So just bear in mind, I'm aware. This is something that I might not normally admit to having, but it's called Visions of the Cailleach by Sarita d'Este and David Rankine, exploring the myths, folklore, and legends of the preeminent Celtic hag goddess. You know, it's a kind of a Froud-informed image on the cover. Who's the artist of that? I don't know. Published by Avalonia. It has a very sort of Wiccan looking, you know, triple goddess kind of publishing symbol and so on. And, you know, it is what it looks like. The sources cited exist. They're not all terrible, but as far as I remember from when I read it, the manner in which the sources are cited is part of what matters. So for example, and again, bear in mind this may be a flawed example, but it says here at the end of page 79, in another version of this tale of the friar, is replaced by St. Patrick, who was too impatient to count the bones which revealed her age, and instead made her disappear in a red flash of misogynistic divine Christian power. Citation number 66, and it refers to a primary resource down here, as far as I can tell. I'm just gonna double. All right, not immediately clear. Primary resource, I think. Anyway, I'll put the information on screen if I can figure it out. So at any rate, the issue here is that it's a primary resource citation, presumably, but there is an editorialization of that information, which may be valid. It's not automatically incorrect. But if they have not linked to a citation that says why it's a red flash of misogynistic divine Christian power, other than just the story itself, which again is a primary, not a secondary commentary, then that's important. Because if it's not verified anywhere else in secondary commentary, that means it's this book's interpretation of that historical information, that primary source material. This is the sort of thing that, okay, you might not follow through on literally every citation in something, but when your curiosity is piqued, that kind of nuance really does matter. So the information in this, though, isn't automatically all garbage, but if what you're trying to do is work through something a bit more dense, that's a bit harder to understand, having something that functions effectively like Cliff Notes isn't the worst thing in the world. It will also start to get you more acquainted with some of the mistakes that some texts may or may not be making. So that if you're reading through this and you go, okay, but the way they presented this one thing is not at all how it seems to be in here. They seem to be right about the first bit of that story, according to the research that I can find, but then it kind of goes off the rails over here. Is that correct or isn't it? That'll help you specify what you're looking at and start to get you answers depending on what your questions are and what your goals are. And being able to articulate that is part of the point. There's a lot to be said for all of these sorts of things. And once again, I have couched this in, loosely speaking, an Irish folkloric context. But interestingly, my own, for example, my own personal aesthetic tastes a lot of the time, as somewhat distinct from my informational tastes, are very heavily influenced by a much more sort of English, with lots of caveats, you can hear the dangerous air quotes, more English aesthetics. Fairies, Fairy Wings, Arthur Rackham, who his representation of fairies definitely like irritated some people in his own time period, which is a really funny dynamic to look into. Some of the people he literally illustrated their books for them were like, "No, I just told you that's not how fairies are supposed to go." And he's like, "I'm Arthur Rackham, dude. I don't care. I didn't read your book. I'm just illustrating it." But anyway, you know, I love the Froud material. I love the stuff that comes out of Dartmoor. I love 80s fantasy. I'm on a huge 80s fairy fantasy kick right now. A lot of my visual tastes, because those are the influences I've been exposed to for a long time, come out of, you know, an educated class, a privileged class's portrayal of fairies from, say, a Victorian romantic perspective. Things that verge into pretty dangerously nationalistic territory, but are visually extremely beautiful to look at. If you, you know, there's a lot to be said for how artistic movements do or don't function in line with how actual folkloric material works from time period to time period. So a lot of the dissonance that I have felt over time, which has actually admittedly at times prevented me from pursuing some of my creative ideas around fairies, is that I feel very fundamentally awkward as an American immigrant with an Irish folkloric informed perspective a lot of the time on fairy folklore, fairy related folklore, otherworldly folklore, but with a kind of an Englishy aesthetic to my own personal preferences. That's awkward. But if I am able to specify some of those differences and feel the dissonance, that facilitates my ability to move out into the world and kind of get a sense for what I want to do going forward with that. Rather than just either choosing to be totally oblivious of it, or just kind of staying stuck in that sensation of frustration, that is where some real creative thinking can come to the foreground and help me problem solve and say, okay, well, I want this to be the main inspiration. My overall tastes go in this line, but I'm going to be really, really clear about the associations with this symbol and that idea and this technique. So that yes, it's going to be visually inspired by this, but the key markers will definitely be there, and any conversation I have, I can absolutely go in this direction with it. So this is kind of what I mean when I say that things get complicated, but I also care not only about detail because I'm me, but I also care quite a lot about nuance. And everybody else gets to kind of figure out where they sit with that. And in my opinion, that's also what facilitates learning. So when we say we're struggling to find advanced books and so on, these are some of the ways in which we can find those things, those advanced resources, because we need to, in getting more advanced, really all advanced means is getting better able to specify what you're looking for. That's really what advanced is. That's what academia is. It's just an increasing level of specification and being able to show your workings for it. So again, not everybody aspires to academic blah, blah, blah. But the point is, anything you wish to advance with, it's more about continuing that seekership, continuing that pursuit, developing your own tried and true techniques for that. And since I see the variety of resources that are out there, since I see that those seem to be under-discussed, that was the avenue I wanted to take with this video. Again, it is not at all my intention to denigrate other methods of approach. But this did seem to be, at least from my own anecdotal perspective, a bit of a gap in terms of discussion, and I felt I had something I could hopefully say about that, assuming, as always, what I said makes sense. So I've been talking forever now, and I'm gonna shut up. So I hope everyone is, by the way, if I leave comments on for this video, which I might, let me know your thoughts. We'll see. I hope everyone's doing well, taking care of themselves to the best of their ability, and being kind, and I will see you all next time. Bye.